Please don't give me to them, my dad. Said that people are kind, the child whispered, hiding behind his back when the hunters arrived. Peter's hand tightened around his spear as he pulled Mila closer behind him. The blue-skinned child trembled against his back, her small fingers digging into his worn leather vest through the curtain of falling water that concealed their cave. He could make out the silhouettes of the hunters, 5, maybe 6 of them, their outlines distorted by the cascading water. They won't find us if we stay quiet, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rushing waterfall. Her dark eyes darted nervously to Duel, who silently sharpened his blade against a smooth stone, each stroke delivered and focused. The metallic scrape sent shivers down Peter's spine. The cave had been their sanctuary for 3 days, long enough to rest, but not long enough to lower their guard. The narrow space behind the waterfall offered protection from the elements and prying eyes, but it could quickly become a trap if discovered. A piercing cry cut through the air, rising above the constant rush of water. It sounded like the territorial call of the razor-beaked predators that hunted in the valleys, but Peter knew better. It was too rhythmic, too controlled. That's their signal, he hissed, shifting his weight forward. There, coordinating, spreading out. Duel stopped sharpening his blade and rose to his feet in one fluid motion. We can't stay here. His voice was a low rumble, calm despite the danger. They'll find the cave soon enough. Mila's grip on Peter's vest tightened. They want to take me back, she whispered, her voice quivering. Please, don't let them take me. Peter turned and knelt before the child, looking into her wide, fearful eyes, startlingly violet against her pale blue skin. I promised your father I would keep you safe, he said firmly, and I will. 3 weeks had passed since they'd found Mila clutching her father's body at the edge of the crimson forest. The man, clearly not from this world like his daughter, had been mortally wounded, his blue skin ashen and cold. With his dying breath he had begged them to protect his child from those who hunted her. They hadn't needed to ask who they were. The reputation of the hunters preceded them, merciless trackers who captured rare specimens for the entertainment and experiments of the wealthy. A stone clattered outside, too close for comfort. One of the hunters was scaling the cliff face beside the waterfall. We need to move now, Sarah urged, already gathering their meager supplies. There's another exit at the back of the cave, a narrow tunnel. I scouted it yesterday. It comes out above the tree line. Peter nodded and turned to Mila. Stay between me and Dull. Don't make a sound. No matter what happens, can you do that? The child nodded, her violet eyes resolute despite her fear. Dull extinguished their small fire with a handful of dirt, plunging the cave into semi-darkness. The only light filtered through the waterfall, casting everything in a wavering blue glow. Sarah led the way, ducking into a crevice at the back of the cave that Peter had mistaken for a shadow. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for Dull's broad shoulders, and rose steeply upward. The rock was damp and slippery under Peter's fingers as he helped Mila navigate the difficult climb. Behind them they heard shouts. The hunters had found the cave. The sounds of splashing water and angry voices echoed up the narrow tunnel, spurring them to move faster. They'll follow our trail, Dull said grimly as they emerged from the tunnel. onto a rocky ledge overlooking the vast expanse of the crimson forest. The trees stretched before them like a sea of blood, their scarlet leaves rustling in the breeze. "Then we'll leave a false one," Peter replied, already scanning the terrain. "The undergrowth is thick near the eastern ravine. We can use it to mask our true direction." They moved quickly along the ridge, helping Mila over the rough terrain. The child was remarkably resilient, never complaining despite the grueling pace. When they reached a suitable point, Peter implemented his plan. He left clear tracks leading toward the eastern ravine, then doubled back through shallow stream, being careful to leave no trace. Meanwhile, Sarah and Doll continued northwest with Mila, heading for the densest part of the crimson forest. Peter rejoined them an hour later, a grim smile on his face. "I left them a few surprises," he said, patting the nearly empty pouch at his belt that had once contained sharpened stakes and tripwires. "It won't stop them for long, but it should slow them down." The crimson forest was both a blessing and a curse. Its dense canopy provided cover from aerial scouts, but the forest floor was a labyrinth of dangers. Blood vines hung from branches like innocent creepers until they sensed warm-blooded prey below, then dropped with lightning speed to ensnare and slowly digest their victims. Pitfalls lined with razor-sharp crystals lay hidden beneath innocent-looking patches of moss, and the indigenous predators, six-legged hunters with chameleon-like abilities, were always watching, always. Clear's throat waiting. "Step where I step," Peter instructed as they entered the forest proper. "Touch nothing you don't have to." They moved in single file, Peter leading, then Mila, Sarah, and Doll bringing up the rear. The eerie silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cries of unfamiliar creatures. For hours they pushed forward, stopping only when Mila's exhaustion became evident. During a brief rest, Sarah pulled out her water skin and offered it to the child. "Thank you," Mila whispered, taking a small sip before handing it back. "Are they still following us?" Dole, who had been keeping watch, nodded solemnly. "They're persistent, but we're leaving them little to track." As if to contradict his words, a distant horn sounded, 3 short blasts. "They found our trail again," Peter said, rising quickly. "We need to move." The chase continued through the day and into the night. The twin moons rose high in the sky, their pale light filtering through the crimson canopy and casting everything in an unsettling blood-red glow. They were forced to stop when the darkness became too thick to navigate safely. Finding a defensible position, a small Clear's throat hollow formed by the massive roots of an ancient tree, they settled in for a few hours of rest. "I'll take first watch," Peter offered, positioning himself where he could observe their back trail. Sarah nodded, already preparing a small sleeping area for Mila. The child curled up against her, exhaustion finally claiming her as she fell into a deep sleep. Dole joined Peter at the lookout, his dark eyes scanning the forest. "They're more determined than usual," he observed quietly. "What makes this child so special?" Peter shook his head. "I don't know her. Father only said to keep her safe, that she was different, whatever that means. It's enough for them to track us across 3 territories." "Her blood," Sarah said softly from behind them. They turned to find her standing there, arms crossed. "I noticed it when I treated her scrapes the first day. It has unusual properties. It glows faintly in darkness. Peter's brow furrowed. You think they want her for her blood? Sarah nodded grimly. This world values the rare and unique. Who knows what they believe it might do for them? The thought made Peter's stomach turn. All the more reason to ensure they never get their hands on her. The night passed without incident, but dawn brought new challenges. The forest grew denser, the undergrowth more treacherous. Twice they had to backtrack when faced with impenetrable thickets of thorns. By midday they reached the banks of a river, wide and turbulent, its waters a strange milky white that concealed whatever might lurk beneath. The river of tears, Sarah murmured, kneeling to dip her fingers in the water. The locals say it's formed from the weeping of the mountains. Can we cross it? Peter asked, eyeing the churning waters with concern. Duel was already moving along the bank, scanning for narrower sections. Not here, he called back. Too wide, too vast. They followed the river northward, the sound of rushing water masking their movements but also potentially hiding the approach of their pursuers. After nearly an hour, they found what they were looking for, a section where the river narrowed between two rock formations. We can build a raft, Peter suggested, eyeing the fallen trees nearby. It doesn't need to be elaborate, just enough to get us across. They worked quickly, Duel cutting branches with his sword while Peter lashed them together with vines that Sarah identified as non-predatory. Mila helped gather smaller branches, her small hands working diligently alongside theirs. The raft was crude but functional. Flat platform of logs bound tightly, enough to support their weight. Using long poles cut from straight saplings, they prepared to navigate the treacherous waters. Stay in the center, Peter instructed Mila as they pushed off from the shore, and hold tight to these vines. The current caught them immediately, pulling the raft into the center of the river where the water moved with frightening speed. Duel and Peter strained with their poles, fighting to keep the craft from spinning or capsizing. Halfway across, disaster struck. Something large bumped against the underside of the raft, nearly upending it. Mila screamed as she was thrown forward, saved from falling into the water only by Sarah's quick reflexes. What was that? Sarah gasped, pulling Mila close. Her question was answered when a massive eel-like creature breached beside the raft, its body glistening white like the river itself. Rows of needle-sharp teeth lined a gaping maw large enough to swallow Mila whole. Duel reacted instantly, driving his pole into the creature's eye. It thrashed in pain, its massive body slamming against the raft and sending water cascading over them. Peter stabbed at it with his spear, aiming for the soft flesh beneath its jaw. The creature dove beneath the surface, the water around them churning violently. For a moment they thought it had retreated until the raft lurched upward, lifted by the beast from below. Jump! Peter shouted, grabbing Mila and leaping for the far shore. The bank was still several yards away, but the alternative was certain death. The cold water shocked his system as they plunged beneath the surface, keeping a firm grip on Mila. Peter kicked hard, fighting the current that threatened to sweep them downstream. The child's alien physiology made her surprisingly buoyant, a small blessing as they struggled toward shore. Behind them, the raft splintered as they Creature's jaws clamped down on it, duel. And Sarah had also abandoned ship, swimming frantically toward them. Peter's feet finally found purchase on the riverbed. With a final surge of effort, he lifted Mila onto the bank. Before hauling himself out of the water, he turned back just in time to see Duel helping Sarah from the river and the massive white eel closing in behind them. "Duel behind you," he shouted, scrambling for his spear, which had somehow stayed in his grip during the chaotic swim. Duel spun, pushing Sarah clear. As the creature lunged, he raised his sword but was a fraction too slow. The beast's teeth grazed his side, tearing through leather and flesh alike. Duel roared in pain but managed to drive his blade deep into the creature's snout. The wounded predator recoiled, thrashing in the shallows before retreating to deeper water, leaving a trail of dark blood that quickly dissipated in the milky current. Duel. Sarah rushed to his side as he collapsed onto the bank, clutching his wounded side. Blood seeped between his fingers, alarmingly bright against his skin. "I'm fine," he grunted, though his ashen face suggested otherwise. "Just a scratch." "Let me see," Sarah insisted gently, moving his hand away. The wound was deep, a ragged gash that ran from his lower ribs to his hip. "This is more than a scratch." Peter turned to Mila, who stood shivering on the bank, her wide eyes fixed on Duel's wound. "Are you hurt?" he asked, quickly checking her for injuries. She shook her head, water dripping from her blue skin. "Is Duel going to die?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Peter said firmly, squeezing her shoulder. "Sarah will help him. She knows how." But Sarah's expression was grim as she examined the wound more thoroughly. "The teeth must have been venomous," she said quietly. "The edges of the wound are already turning black." Duel's breathing had become labored, his skin clammy to the touch. "Poison?" he asked through gritted teeth. Sarah nodded. "I need to make a poultice to draw it out, but I don't have the right herbs." Peter scanned their surroundings. They had emerged on the western bank of the river, where the crimson forest gave way to rolling hills covered in strange, bulbous vegetation. "What do you need?" "I'll find it." Sarah described several plants, one with star-shaped blue leaves, another with three-pronged yellow flowers, and a particular fungus that grew on dead wood. "But the most important is white stem," she added. "It has a pale, almost translucent stalk and red berries. It grows on cliff faces, usually in shade." Peter nodded, memorizing the descriptions. "Stay hidden," he instructed. "I'll be back as quickly as I can." Finding suitable shelter was their first priority. With Peter's help, Sarah and Mela managed to move Dal to a small depression beneath an overhanging rock. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some protection from the elements and would be difficult to spot from a distance. "Take care of them," Peter said to Mela, surprising himself with the responsibility he was placing on the child's shoulders. But something in her violet eyes told him she was stronger than she appeared. "I will," she promised solemnly. With a final nod to Sarah, Peter set out in search of the healing plants. The fungus and starleaf plant were relatively easy to find, but the three-pronged flower proved more elusive. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, he finally spotted the distinctive yellow blooms nestled a rocky outcropping. The white stem, as Sarah had warned, proved the most challenging. Peter spent precious time scaling Steep cliff face, his fingers finding minimal purchase on the smooth rock. Twice he nearly fell, saved only by his quick reflexes and the sturdy vines he used to secure himself. When he finally spotted the translucent stalks growing from a narrow crevice, he felt a surge of triumph. The plant was, just as Sarah had described, ghostly. Pale stems topped with clusters of bright red berries. He carefully harvested several stalks, making sure to include the roots that Sarah had emphasized were crucial. The return journey was made more treacherous by the failing light and his unwillingness to use a torch that might attract attention. By the time he reached their makeshift shelter, the twin moons were high in the sky. "I found them," he announced quietly, ducking under the overhang. "All of them." Sarah looked up from where she sat beside Duel, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. Duel was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Mila sat on his other side, her small hand resting on his forehead. "His fever is getting worse," Sarah said, taking the plants from Peter and immediately setting to work. She crushed the star leaves and fungus together with a smooth stone, adding water to create a paste. The three-pronged flowers she set aside, explaining they would be used to make a tea once the poultice had drawn out the worst of the poison. The white stem required more careful preparation. Sarah peeled back the outer layer of the stalk to reveal a gelatinous core that glistened in the moonlight. This she applied directly to the wound, which had now swollen and turned an alarming shade of purple. "The poison has spread," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "If I had these herbs sooner." "Will he live?" Peter asked bluntly. Sarah didn't answer immediately, focusing on binding the poultice in place with strips torn from her own tunic. Finally she looked up, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I don't know. The next few hours will tell." They took turns watching over Duel. Through the night, when it was Peter's shift, he sat with his back against the rock wall, spear across his knees, dividing his attention between the wounded man and the surrounding darkness. Mila came to sit beside him, her small form a ghostly presence in the moonlight. "It's my fault," she whispered, hugging her knees to her chest. "If you weren't protecting me, Duel wouldn't be hurt." Peter shook his head. "No, little one. Duel made his choice, just as Sarah and I did. We protect you because it's right, not because we have to." "But why?" She pressed, her violet eyes searching his face. "Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know?" It was a question Peter had asked himself many times over the past weeks. Why had they taken on this burden, this danger? The answer came to him with surprising clarity. "Because your father looked at us and saw something worth trusting," he said slowly. "In a world where trust is rare, that means something, and because you deserve a chance to live without fear." Mila was silent for a long moment. "My father said humans were different," she finally said. "He said your kind had capacity for great cruelty, but also great kindness. He said you could choose." "And what do you think?" Peter asked, curious about the child's perspective. "I think he was right," she said simply. "The hunters choose cruelty, you, Sarah, and Doll choose kindness." Her words stayed with Peter long after she had drifted off to sleep, her head resting against his arm. The simplicity of her assessment cut through the complexity of their situation, reducing it to its essence, a choice between cruelty and kindness. Dawn brought a measure of hope. Dale's fever had broken during the night, and, though he remained weak, the blackness around his wound had receded. Sarah's herbal knowledge had saved his life. "You look terrible," Dal croaked when he finally opened his eyes to find all three of them hovering over him. "You should see yourself," Peter replied, with a relieved grin. Dal attempted to sit up but fell back with a grunt of pain. "How long was I out?" "All night," Sarah answered, checking his bandages. "The poison nearly killed you." "But it didn't," he said, his eyes finding Mila, "still here to protect our little blue friend." Mila's face broke into a smile, the first genuine one Peter had seen since they'd found her. It transformed her features, making her look like the child she was, rather than the hunted fugitive she'd been forced to become. Their moment of relief was short-lived. A distant horn sounded from the direction of the river. The hunters had crossed and were once again on their trail. "We need to move," Peter said, his body tensing at the sound. "Can you walk, Dull?" The big man grimaced but nodded. "With help." Sarah and Peter positioned themselves on either side of Dull, supporting his weight as he struggled to his feet. His face paled with the effort, but he remained upright, determination etched in every line of his face. "I'll slow you down," he said, his voice strained. "You should leave me." "Not a chance," Peter replied firmly. "We move together or not at all." Their progress was painfully slow. Dull could manage only a shambling walk, and they had to stop frequently to rest. By midday they had covered less ground than they would normally traverse in an hour. The land rose steadily before them, the rolling hills giving way to more rugged terrain. In the distance, jagged mountains loomed, their peaks lost in clouds. "There," Sarah said during one of their rest periods, pointing to a narrow pass between two smaller peaks. "If we can reach that pass, we might lose them in the highlands." Peter nodded, but privately he doubted Dull could make the climb in his condition. They needed a new plan, a way to either throw off their pursuers or confront them on favorable terms. As they resumed their difficult journey, Peter's mind raced through possibilities. Setting traps might delay the hunters, but wouldn't stop them. Splitting up was too risky. Divided, they were more vulnerable. Direct confrontation was suicide given their current state. They paused at the edge of a steep ravine that cut across their path like a scar in the earth. Far below, a stream rushed over rocks, the water a strange iridescent green that suggested toxicity. "We can't cross here," Sarah said, surveying the sheer drop. "We'll have to find another way around." Dull leaned heavily against a boulder, his face drawn with pain despite his efforts to hide it. "Or we make our stand here," he suggested. "The ravine at our backs force them to come at us head-on." Peter was about to reject the idea when a flicker of movement in the valley below caught his eye. He signaled for silence and dropped to a crouch, gesturing for the others to do the same. Through a gap in the rocks, they could see a makeshift camp nestled in a protected hollow. Tents of animal hide were arranged in a rough circle around a central fire pit. Men moved among them, not just any men, but hunters identifiable by their distinctive leather armor adorned with trophies from their kills. "It's their base camp," Peter whispered, counting at least a dozen figures. The ones tracking us must be a smaller scouting party. Sarah's expression darkened. There are too many. We can't possibly fight them. Oh. No, Peter agreed, but now we know where they are, and knowledge is a weapon in itself. They retreated carefully, finding a sheltered spot some distance from the ravine where they could rest and plan. Dull's condition had worsened again, the exertion of their journey taking its toll. Sarah prepared another herbal treatment, but her supply of the crucial white stem was nearly exhausted. As night fell, Peter made a decision. I'm going to their camp, he announced as they huddled around a tiny shielded fire. I need to know why they want Mila so badly. What makes her so valuable to them? It's too dangerous, he and Sarah protested. If they catch you, they won't. Peter cut her off. I'll observe. Only no risks. Dull, propped against a rock, nodded his approval. Information is what we need most right now. Under the cover of darkness, Peter made his way back to the ravine, then followed its edge until he found a path leading down to the valley. Moving with the stealth he'd developed through years of survival in this hostile world, he approached the hunter's camp. Most of the men were gathered around the large central fire, drinking from crude cups and talking loudly. Peter crept closer, finding cover behind a stack of supply crates at the edge of the camp. Taking too long, one man was saying, his face scarred and weathered. The client is getting impatient. Baron's group will find them, another replied, this one wearing a necklace of what looked disturbingly like humanoid fingers. They've never lost a quarry yet. This one's different, the scarred man argued. The blue child worth more than all our previous contracts combined. Peter's ears pricked up at the mention of Mila. What's so special about her anyway? Younger hunter asked. She looks like any other off-worlder to me. The question was answered by an older man who had remained silent until now. When he spoke, the others fell quiet, suggesting his position of authority. Her blood, he said simply. The client believes it contains the key to extended life, perhaps even immortality. Murmurs rippled through the group at this revelation. Immortality, the young hunter scoffed. Sounds like superstition to me. The leader fixed him with a cold stare. It doesn't matter what you believe. What matters is that the client is willing to pay an amount that would make each of us wealthy beyond imagination. All we need to do is deliver the child, alive and unharmed. And the others with her, someone asked. The leader shrugged. Kill them. They're nothing but obstacles. Peter had heard enough. Carefully, he backed away from his hiding place, mind racing with the implications of what he'd learned. Immortality. It seemed fantastical, yet he had seen enough of this strange world to know that what seemed impossible often wasn't. He was nearly clear of the camp when disaster struck. A sentry he hadn't noticed emerged from behind a tent, nearly colliding with him. There was a moment of mutual surprise before the man opened his mouth to shout in alarm. Peter reacted instinctively, driving his fist into the man's throat, crushing his windpipe before he could make a sound. The hunter collapsed, choking silently, but the damage was done. Another sentry had spotted the commotion and raised the alarm. Abandoning stealth, Peter sprinted for the path leading up from the valley. Shouts erupted behind him, followed by the distinctive whistle of arrows cutting through the air. One grazed his shoulder leaving a burning trail across his skin, but he didn't slow. He reached the path and began the steep climb, loose rocks sliding beneath his feet. Behind him, the hunters were organizing a pursuit, their voices carrying clearly in the night air. Peter pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the warm trickle of blood down his arm. He had to reach the others to warn them of the imminent danger. When he finally crested the ridge, he found Sarah waiting, anxiously, spear in hand. "I heard shouting," she said, her eyes widening at the sight of his wound. "What happened?" "No time," he gasped, pushing past her. "We need to move now." Back at their temporary shelter, Duel was already on his feet, leaning heavily on a makeshift staff but determined. Mila stood beside him, her small face serious as she helped gather their few possessions. "They know about her blood," Peter explained as they moved out, heading away from the ravine as quickly as Duel's condition would allow. "Someone is paying them to capture her. They believe her blood holds the secret to immortality." "Immortality," Sarah repeated incredulously. "Is that possible?" "I don't know," Peter admitted, "but it explains their persistence." Mila had gone very still. "My father said they would never stop," she whispered. "That's why he brought me here to this world. He thought we could hide." The revelation that Mila and her father had intentionally come to this dangerous world raised new questions. But there was no time to explore them. The hunters would be on their trail soon, and in greater numbers than before. "We need a new plan," Dahl said, grimacing with each step. "We can't outrun them, not with me like this." Peter nodded grimly. "Then we stop running and start fighting on our terms." They pushed on through the night, making for higher ground where the terrain might give them an advantage. By dawn, they had reached a series of narrow canyons carved by ancient rivers into the living rock. The wind howled through these natural corridors, creating an eerie moaning sound that gave the place its name, the Canyons of Wind. "This is where we make our stand," Peter declared, surveying the labyrinthine passages. "We can use the canyons to separate them, deal with them in smaller groups." Sarah and Dahl nodded in agreement. Even Mila seemed to understand the gravity of their decision, her young face set in determination. They spent the morning setting traps, deadfalls made from balanced rocks, tripwires strung across narrow passages, pits disguised with lightweight branches and leaves. Peter showed Mila how to help, the child proving surprisingly adept at the delicate work. By midday, they had transformed the canyon entrance into a gauntlet of death and injury. Now they needed to draw the hunters in. "I'll be the bait," Peter decided. "I'll let them spot me, then lead them into the canyon." "Too risky," Dahl objected. "If they catch you before you reach the traps." "They won't," Peter assured him. "I'm faster than they are, especially in this terrain." Reluctantly, the others agreed to the plan. Sarah and Dahl would position themselves at strategic points within the canyon, ready to ambush any hunters who made it past the traps. Mila would remain hidden in a small cave high up one of the canyon walls, accessible only by a narrow, easily defensible path. "Stay there until one of us comes for you," Peter instructed her firmly. "No matter what you hear, promise me." "I promise," she said solemnly, her violet eyes holding his gaze. "Be careful." Peter squeezed her shoulder gently. Always am. With the plan set, Peter made his way back down toward the plains, finding a visible position on a rocky outcrop. He didn't have to wait long. Within an hour he spotted the hunting party ascending the slope, at least 15 men, heavily armed and moving with the confidence of predators who sensed their prey was cornered. Peter allowed himself to be seen making a show of surprise and fear before retreating toward the canyon. The hunters immediately gave chase exactly as he'd hoped. He maintained a careful pace, staying just far enough ahead to keep them pursuing, but not so far that they'd suspect a trap. As he entered the canyon, he heard the first of his traps spring, a satisfying crash followed by screams of pain and alarm. He didn't look back, focusing instead on navigating the twisting passage to where Sarah waited with her bow. The second trap claimed 2 more hunters, a deadfall that crushed one outright and pinned another beneath heavy rocks. The survivors hesitated, suddenly aware of the danger, but their leader urged them forward, his voice carrying clearly. In the canyon, he's alone. The child must be ahead. 10,000 credits to the man who captures her. The promise of wealth spurred them on. Caution forgotten in their greed, Peter reached Sarah's position and took cover beside her on a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon floor. 8 left, he whispered, notching an arrow to his bow. Maybe 9. Sarah nodded, her own bow ready. Dole is in position further up. He can't fight hand to hand, but he's a good shot even wounded. The remaining hunters appeared below them, moving more cautiously now, weapons drawn and eyes scanning the canyon walls. Peter waited until they were directly beneath the ledge, then gave a low whistle, the signal to attack. Arrows rained down on the hunters, finding gaps in their leather armor or piercing exposed throats and faces. 3 fell in the first volley, dead before they hit the ground. The others scattered, seeking cover among the rocks. Up there, one shouted, spotting Peter and Sarah on their ledge. He raised his crossbow, but Sarah's arrow took him in the eye before he could fire. The remaining hunters retreated around a bend in the canyon, regrouping beyond the range of Peter and Sarah's bows. Peter signaled to Sarah, and they quickly changed position, moving to another prepared vantage point further up the canyon. From their new position, they could see the hunters conferring, their leader gesturing angrily. Then, to Peter's alarm, they split into 2 groups, one continuing up the main canyon while the other began scaling the wall toward a side passage. "They're trying to flank us," he hissed. "And that passage leads toward Mila's hiding place." Sarah's face paled. "Go," she urged. "I can handle these ones." Peter didn't hesitate, scrambling up a narrow chimney in the rock that served as a shortcut to the upper canyon levels. His muscles burned with the effort, but fear for Mila drove him onward. He emerged onto a ledge just as the flanking group of hunters reached the side passage. There were 4 of them, moving swiftly and confidently across terrain that should have been unfamiliar. Either they were exceptionally skilled, or they had somehow obtained knowledge of the canyon's layout. Peter moved parallel to them, staying high and out of sight. He needed to get ahead of them to reach Mila before they did. A gap appeared in the canyon wall, too wide to jump, but crossable via a fallen log that formed a natural bridge. Peter hesitated only briefly before making the perilous crossing the log, shifting alarmingly beneath his weight. Once across, he increased his pace, taking risks he would normally avoid, leaping gaps, sliding down loose scree, climbing near vertical faces with minimal handholds. His heart pounded not from exertion, but from fear. Fear that he would be too late. The cave, where they had hidden Mila, came into view ahead just as Peter spotted the hunters emerging onto the same ledge. From another route, they had beaten him there, but only just, without thinking. Peter let out a war cry, drawing his knife as he charged. The hunters turned, surprised by the attack from behind. Peter crashed into the first one before he could raise his weapon, driving his knife up under the man's ribs. Hot blood gushed over his hand as he twisted the blade, ensuring a fatal wound. The other three recovered quickly, forming a semicircle around Peter with weapons drawn. And GT clears throat. And GT. One carried a wicked-looking curved sword, another a short spear, and the third a pair of serrated daggers. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," the one with the sword said, his scarred face twisting into a sneer. "But it's over now. Tell us where the child is, and we might let you live." "Come and find out," Peter growled, shifting his grip on his bloodied knife. They attacked in unison, a coordinated assault that spoke of long experience fighting together. Peter ducked the sword, blocked the spear with his forearm, but one of the daggers found his thigh, slicing deep. He grunted in pain, but didn't falter, driving his shoulder into the dagger wielder's chest and sending him staggering backward. The fight was brief but vicious. Peter fought with the desperation of a man protecting something more valuable than his own life. He took wounds, a slice across his back, a deep cut on his arm, but gave worse than he received. Dagger wielder fell first, his throat opened by a lucky slash. The spearman followed, his weapon turned against him in a quick reversal that left him impaled on his own blade. The swordsman proved more challenging. He was skilled and strong, his blade moving and blurring arcs that Peter could barely track, let alone defend against. A slash opened Peter's cheek to the bone, and another nearly took his hand off at the wrist. Bleeding from multiple wounds, Peter was forced back step by step, his strength failing. The swordsman sensed victory, pressing his advantage with increased ferocity. In a desperate gambit, Peter allowed himself to stumble, appearing more grievously wounded than he was. The swordsman moved in for the kill, sword raised for a decapitating strike. At the last possible moment, Peter surged upward inside the arc of the sword, driving his knife into the man's throat with every ounce of strength he had left. The swordsman's eyes widened in shock, his own attack forgotten as his life's blood poured out around Peter's embedded blade. He made a wet gurgling sound, then collapsed, dead before he hit the ground. Peter stood swaying, blood streaming from his numerous wounds. The world seemed to tilt around him, darkness encroaching at the edges of his vision. With tremendous effort, he staggered toward Mila's cave, determined to ensure she was still safe. "Mila," he called weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's me, it's safe to come out." There was no response. Fear gave him a fresh surge of strength as he reached the cave entrance and peered inside. The small space was empty. "Mila," he called more urgently, panic rising in his chest. Had the hunters somehow reached her? First had she fled in fear. A small sound from above made him look. Up there, clinging to a tiny ledge near the cave ceiling, was Mila, her blue skin blending remarkably well with the shadowed rock. "Peter," she whispered, her violet eyes wide with fear. "Is it really you?" "It's me," he confirmed, relief washing over him. "You can come down now, you're safe." She descended with surprising agility, dropping the last few feet into his arms. He winced as her weight pressed against his wounds, but held her tightly nonetheless. "I heard fighting," she said, her face buried against his chest. "I was so scared." "I know," he soothed, stroking her hair. "But you did exactly what you should have. You stayed hidden." A shout from below drew their attention. More hunters. Peter wasn't sure he had the strength to face another fight, but the voice that called his name wasn't that of a hunter. It was Sarah's. She appeared on the ledge moments later, bow in hand and a fresh cut across her forehead, but otherwise unharmed. "Peter," she exclaimed, rushing to his side when she saw the extent of his injuries. "Gods, you're a mess. You should see the other guys," he joked weakly, then swayed alarmingly as his strength finally gave out. Sarah caught him before he could fall, easing him to a sitting position with his back against the rock wall. "Dull?" he asked through gritted teeth, as she began examining his wounds. "Alive," she confirmed. "He got 2 more with his bow. The rest fled when they realized how many they'd lost." "They'll be back," Peter said grimly. "With more men." Sarah nodded, tearing strips from her tunic to bind his worst wounds, "but not today. We've bought ourselves some time." Mila watched anxiously as Sarah worked, her small hands clenched together. "Can I help?" she asked timidly. Sarah gave her a gentle smile. "Yes, little one. Fetch my pack from the cave. I have herbs that will help stop the bleeding." With Mila's assistance, Sarah treated Peter's wounds as best she could. None were immediately life-threatening, but the cumulative blood loss had weakened him significantly. He would need time to recover, time they might not have. "We need to move," Peter insisted once Sarah had finished her ministrations. "Find somewhere more defensible." "You're in no condition to travel." Sarah objected. "Neither is Doll." "We can't stay here," he argued. "They know where we are now." Their debate was interrupted by a strange sound, a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mila gasped, pressing closer to Peter's side. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, reaching for her bow. The answer came in the form of a massive shape that materialized at the edge of the ledge, a wolf-like creature with shaggy blue fur and eyes that glowed like embers in the gathering dusk. It was easily twice the size of a normal wolf, its shoulders level with Sarah's. "Jest." Peter tried to reach for his knife, only to remember it was still embedded in the swordsman's throat. Sarah had knocked an arrow but hesitated to fire, something in the creature's demeanor giving her pause. The wolf took a step forward, its massive paws silent on the stone. Then, to their astonishment, it lowered its head in what could only be described as a gesture of respect. "It's not attacking," Sarah murmured slowly, lowering her bow. Mila stepped forward before either adult could stop her, her hand outstretched toward the massive predator. "I know you," she said softly. "You're like me. Not from here." The wolf rumbled deep in its chest, a sound that might have been agreement. It padded forward, gently touching its muzzle to Mila's palm. Mila, Peter called quietly, afraid any sudden movement might provoke the beast. Come back here slowly, but the child showed no fear. He won't hurt us, she said with absolute certainty. He's been following us, watching over us. Sarah and Peter exchanged bewildered glances. How do you know that? Sarah asked. Mila turned to them, her expression serene. I can feel it here. She touched her temple. He thinks in colors, not words. But I understand. The revelation that Mila possessed some form of telepathic ability with the wolf creature was yet another surprise in a day full of them. But there was no time to explore this new development. Night was falling, and with it came new dangers. Can he help us? Peter asked, deciding to accept this strange turn of events. Without question. Survival often depended on adaptability. Mila conferred silently with the wolf, then nodded. He knows a place safe not far. With the wolf's help, they retrieved Dal from his position further down the canyon. The big man was pale and exhausted, but had suffered no new injuries. He accepted the wolf's presence with the same pragmatic attitude as Peter. In this world, allies were too precious to reject, no matter how unusual. The wolf led them along hidden paths through the canyon system, routes that no human could have discovered without guidance. Creature moved with silent confidence, occasionally doubling back to ensure they were following or to help Mila over particularly difficult terrain. Their destination proved to be a cave high in the canyon wall, accessible only via a narrow winding path that would be easy to defend. Inside, the cave opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber with a small freshwater spring bubbling from the rock and draining away through crack in the floor. Perfect, Sarah breathed, helping Dal to sit against the wall. The wolf remained at the entrance, its massive body effectively blocking the only way in or out. It seemed to have appointed itself their guardian, a role they were grateful to accept given their weakened state. Safe for the moment, they allowed themselves to rest. Sarah redressed Peter's wounds, then checked on Dal, whose condition had stabilized but remained precarious. Mila curled up between them, exhaustion finally claiming her as she fell into a deep sleep. What do we do now? Sarah asked quietly, her eyes meeting Peter's across the sleeping child. We can't keep running forever. Peter had been pondering the same question. No, he agreed, but I'm not sure we have many options. The hunters won't give up, not with the reward they've been promised. Could we try to reason with their client? Sarah suggested. Explain that Mila is a child, not a resource to be exploited. Peter shook his head. People wealthy enough to offer that kind of reward don't generally care about moral arguments. Besides, we don't even know who they are. Then we need to find somewhere they can't follow, Dal said, his voice weak, but his mind still sharp. Somewhere beyond their reach. Is there such a place on this world? Sarah wondered. Dal was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Maybe not on this world, he said finally, but I've heard stories of the Northern Territories, the quiet lands they call them. It said even the fiercest predators won't venture there. Why not? Peter asked, intrigued. Despite his skepticism, no one knows for certain, Dal admitted. Some say the air itself is poisonous to most creatures. Others believe powerful beings guard the boundaries, allowing only those they deem worthy to pass. Sarah looked dubious. Sounds like a myth to me. Perhaps, Dahl conceded, but all myths contain a grain of truth, and right now, a myth may be our best hope. Peter considered the idea. The journey north would be arduous, especially in their condition, but if there was even a chance of finding a safe haven for Mila, wasn't it worth the risk? We'll need supplies, he said finally, and time to recover. Neither of us is in any shape to travel far. Sarah nodded in agreement. A few days. At least, the hunters won't return immediately. They'll need to regroup, tend their wounded, perhaps send for reinforcements. Their decision made, they settled into heal and prepare. The wolf came and went, sometimes disappearing for hours, only to return with fresh game, strain. Rabbit-like creatures with 6 legs and thick fur that Sarah pronounced safe to eat after careful examination. Mila spent much of her time with the wolf, the two communicating in their silent, mysterious way. From her, they learned that the creature had no name as humans would understand it, but she had taken to calling him Azure for his distinctive blue coat. 3 days passed in relative peace. Peter's wounds began to heal, the deeper cuts closing cleanly thanks to Sarah's herbal treatments. Duel's recovery was slower, but the infection had been fully purged from his system, and his natural strength was gradually returning. On the morning of the 4th day, Azure returned from one of his hunting expeditions in obvious agitation. He paced the cave entrance occasionally, emitting low growls that echoed off the stone walls. "What's wrong?" Peter asked Mila, who had been watching the wolf with growing concern. She placed a hand on Azure's flank, her eyes closing in concentration. "People," she said after a moment, "many people coming this way." Peter exchanged alarmed glances with Sarah and Duel. "The hunters," Mila shook her head. "Different, not hunters but armed." This was a new complication. Who else would be in these remote canyons, and why? Peter wasn't inclined to wait and find out. "We need to move," he decided now, before they get too close. They gathered their meager belongings quickly, having learned to travel light through necessity. Dole was able to walk without assistance now, though he still tired quickly. Peter's wounds pulled uncomfortably with each movement, but he ignored the pain, focusing on the more immediate concern of their escape. Azure led them out of the cave and up a nearly invisible path that switchbacked up the canyon wall. The climb was arduous, especially for Dole, but the wolf seemed to understand their limitations, pausing frequently to allow them to rest. When they finally reached the top, they found themselves on a high plateau, overlooking the entire canyon system. From this vantage point they could see the group that had triggered Azure's warning, a band of perhaps 20 individuals moving methodically through the canyons below. They were indeed armed, but as Mila had said, they didn't move like hunters. Their formation was more defensive than aggressive, as if they expected to be attacked at any moment. "Who are they?" Sarah wondered aloud, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Doesn't matter," Peter replied, "as long as they're not following us." They set out across the plateau, heading north as Dole had suggested. The landscape grew increasingly barren as they traveled, the scrubby vegetation giving way to bare rock and eventually to fields of ice and snow as they ascended into higher elevations. The cold was a new enemy, one they were ill-equipped to fight. Their clothing, designed for the more temperate regions they had left behind, provided little protection against the biting wind and freezing temperatures. They huddled together at night, Azure's massive body providing welcome warmth as they slept in shifts, one always keeping watch while the others rested. Game became scarcer, forcing them to ration their dwindling food supplies. Even Azure struggled to find prey in this desolate landscape. Water at least was plentiful, though they had to melt snow and ice over small, carefully managed fires. After 5 days of grueling travel, they found themselves facing a mountain range that stretched across the horizon like a wall of stone and ice. There was no visible path through, around, or over the formidable barrier. The frostspine, Dwell named it his, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. According to the legends, the quiet lands lie beyond. If they exist at all, Sarah added, unable to keep the doubt from her voice. Peter surveyed the imposing mountains with a growing sense of despair. Even at full strength, scaling those peaks would be a monumental challenge. In their current condition, with a child to protect and dwindling supplies, it seemed impossible. We need to find a pass, he said. Finally, there must be a way through. They spent the next day searching for such a passage, following the base of the mountains eastward. The weather worsened, a bitter wind driving snow and ice into their faces with such force that it felt like 1,000 tiny knives cutting into their exposed skin. And GT, Clear's throat. And GT. Mila struggled the most, her smaller body losing heat more quickly despite being wrapped in every spare piece of clothing they possessed. Peter took to carrying her for long stretches, ignoring the protest of his still healing wounds. Just as it seemed they would have to turn back or risk freezing to death, Azure let out a series of excited barks. The wolf bounded ahead, then returned, clearly wanting them to follow. He's found something, Mila said, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face. They followed Azure to what appeared at first to be nothing more than a shadow. On the mountainside, closer inspection revealed it to be the entrance to a narrow tunnel, a natural formation, perhaps, or an ancient riverbed that had cut through the stone over millennia. A way through, Sarah suggested. Hopefully. Peter examined the tunnel entrance with caution. It was dark and forbidding, the air emanating from it noticeably warmer than the surrounding atmosphere, an unnatural warmth that set his instincts on edge. I don't like it, he admitted, but I don't see that we have much choice. We can't stay out here much longer. Dull nodded in agreement. The tunnel it is, but stay alert. This doesn't feel right. They entered single file, Peter leading with a makeshift torch, Mila close behind him, then Sarah with Dull and Azure bringing up the rear. The tunnel narrowed quickly, forcing them to proceed in a half-crouch. The walls were smooth, almost polished, reinforcing Peter's suspicion that this was no natural formation. The warmth increased as they progressed, soon becoming uncomfortably hot. Sweat trickled down Peter's back, a stark contrast to the freezing conditions they'd left behind. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, carrying a strange metallic scent that made his head swim. Something's wrong, Sarah gasped from behind him. The air. It's doing something to me. Peter felt it too, a heaviness in his limbs, a clouding of his thoughts. Mila had begun to sway on her feet, her eyes unfocused. We need to turn back, he decided, fighting against the growing lethargy that threatened to overwhelm him. But as they turned, they found the tunnel behind them blocked by a smooth wall of stone that hadn't been there moments before. Dull pressed his hands against it, searching for a hidden mechanism or weak point, but found nothing. Trapped, he growled the single word, summing up their dire situation. With no choice but to continue forward, they pressed on, each step requiring more effort than the last. The tunnel began to slope downward, leading them deeper into the mountains. The heat became almost unbearable, their clothes sticking to their sweat-soaked bodies. Just as Peter felt he couldn't take another step, the tunnel abruptly opened into a vast cavern. The transition was so sudden that he staggered, nearly falling. Mila's small hand gripped his, steadying him. What they saw defied explanation. The cavern stretched before them, so vast that its far walls were lost in shadow. But it wasn't the size that struck them speechless, it was what filled the space. Structures rose from the cavern floor, buildings of a design unlike anything Peter had ever seen, constructed of a material that seemed to glow with an inner light. A city, Sarah breathed, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this wonder. An entire city hidden inside the mountain. And GT, clears throat. And GT, but it was a city without sound, without movement. The structures stood silent and empty, as if the inhabitants had simply vanished, leaving everything intact. What is this place? Joel wondered, his voice hushed with awe. The answer came not in words, but in a sudden awareness that flooded their minds, knowledge implanted directly into their consciousness by an unseen intelligence. This had been a refuge built by beings who had fled here long ago to escape some cataclysm that had threatened their existence. They had created this hidden world, sealed away from the dangers outside, and lived here for generations. But something had gone wrong. The same technology that had sustained them had eventually failed, or perhaps been sabotaged. The inhabitants had died or fled, leaving behind only their empty city and the automated systems that still functioned after untold years. The knowledge faded as quickly as it had come, leaving them disoriented and shaken. Did you feel that? Peter asked, needing confirmation that he hadn't imagined the strange mental intrusion. The others nodded, equally disturbed. Only Mila seemed unsurprised. They're still here, she said simply. Not gone. Just changed. Before Peter could ask what she meant, movement caught his eye. Figures were emerging from the shadows between the buildings, tall, slender beings with skin that shimmered with the same luminescence as the structures around them. They moved with fluid grace, approaching the small group of travelers with neither haste nor hesitation. Peter instinctively reached for his weapon, but found his arm wouldn't respond to his command. The others appeared similarly affected, frozen in place by some invisible force. The beings surrounded them, their featureless faces betraying no emotion. One stepped forward, its form seeming to ripple and shift as it moved, never quite settling into a fixed shape. You bring violence to our sanctuary. Voice spoke directly into their minds. Your thoughts are filled with conflict, with pursuit and evasion. We had no choice, Peter responded, surprised to find he could still speak. We're protecting the child, others hunt. Sorry. The being's attention shifted to Mila, who met its gaze without fear. For a long moment they seemed to communicate silently, much as she did. With Azure, you are not of this world, the being finally said, addressing Mila directly. Nor are you entirely of your own. You are between. And GT clears throat. And GT, Mila nodded as if this made perfect sense. My father said we were travelers, that our kind had been traveling between worlds for a very long time. And GT clears throat. And GT, and these others, the being inquired, indicating Peter, Sarah, and Duel. They are not of your kind, yet they risk their lives to protect you. They're my friends, Amelia said simply. My family now. The being seemed to consider this, its form shifting subtly. Family, it repeated the concept. Apparently novel, bonds not of kind but of choice. Yes, Amelia confirmed, the strongest bonds. Another silent exchange followed, during which the other beings moved closer, examining the travelers with what felt like curiosity. Asher growled low in his throat, but made no move to attack, sensing perhaps that aggression would be futile against these strange entities. Finally, the first being addressed them. All again. We have existed here in isolation for time beyond your comprehension. Once we had physical form like yours. Now we are different. But we remember what it was to be vulnerable, to need sanctuary. Hope stirred in Peter's chest. Then you'll help us. We will allow you passage through our domain. The being clarified, beyond lies the land you seek, where those who hunt you cannot follow, but we offer a choice as well. What choice? Sarah asked cautiously. You may stay here among us. This city stands empty, but its systems still function. You would have shelter, sustenance, safety. The offer was tempting, especially after weeks of constant danger and deprivation, but something in the being's tone gave Peter pause. At what cost? He asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. The being's form rippled again, perhaps the equivalent of a shrug. Those who stay eventually become like us. The process is neither painful nor rapid, but it is inevitable. The energies that sustain this place change all who dwell here for too long. Change us how? Dole demanded. You would transcend your physical forms, become energy, consciousness without the limitations of flesh. Some consider it evolution, others might call it death. The clarification landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of unease through the group. Sanctuary, but at the cost of their very humanity. And if we choose to continue on, Peter asked, then you may rest here briefly. Replenish your strength and supplies, and we will show you the path forward. But know that the lands beyond, while safe from your hunters, hold their own dangers. It was no choice at all, really. Whatever awaited them beyond this hidden city, it had to be better than a slow transformation into something other than human. We'll continue on, Peter decided, looking to the others for confirmation. Sarah and Dahl nodded in agreement. Even Mila, who might have found more kinship with these strange beings than with her human protectors, showed no hesitation in her choice. The being inclined what passed for its head. As you wish, rest now. When you are ready, the path will be shown to you. True to their word, the beings provided. For their needs, food appeared strange, but nourishing fruits and what seemed to be synthesized proteins. Clean water flowed from fountains. Throughout the city, they were given access to a structure that served as a dwelling, complete with bathing facilities and soft surfaces for sleeping. For 2 days they rested, recovering their strength and treating their remaining injuries. The beings kept their distance, observing but not interfering. Only Mila sought them out, engaging those silent communications that left her thoughtful but unwilling to share what had been discussed. On the morning of the 3rd day, one of the beings appeared at their dwelling. "It is time," it announced simply, "if you still wish to depart." Their decision unchanged, they gathered their supplies, now replenished with food and water containers, even clothing better suited to the cold they would face, and followed the being through the silent city. Their guide led them to the far side of the cavern, where a tunnel similar to the one they had entered through awaited. "This will take you to the surface," being explained. "Beyond lies the land your companion spoke of, what you call the quiet lands. Why is it that our hunters cannot follow us there?" Sarah asked, still skeptical despite all they had witnessed. "The quiet lands exist partially outside your reality," the being said, "a fold in the fabric of space created long ago by the same cataclysm that drove our kind to seek refuge here. Only those with certain attributes can perceive the entrance, let alone pass through it. And we have these attributes." Dual question. The being's form shifted in what might have been amusement. "The child does, and through her, you. Her kind exists between realities. It is why her blood is valued by those who seek extended life. It allows them to slip between the cracks of existence, to cheat death by stepping sideways into adjacent possibilities." This revelation cast Mila's pursuers in an even more disturbing light. They hadn't been seeking mere longevity, but a form of immortality achieved by slipping from one reality to another. When death approached in their own, will we be able to return if we need to? Peter asked, thinking of the sanctuary they were leaving behind. Dangerous though its long-term effects might be, the path works in both directions. Being confirmed, but few choose to return once they have experienced the quiet lands. It has an effect on the consciousness that many find preferable to alternatives. With that cryptic warning, the being gestured toward the tunnel. "Go now, and remember, what seems like an ending is often merely a transition." They said their goodbyes, Mila lingering longest to commune one final time with the strange entities that had given them shelter. Then with resolute steps they entered the tunnel that would take them to the surface and beyond. Unlike their entry tunnel, this passage was cool and comfortable, the air fresh and easy to breathe. It rose steadily, curving gently upward toward what Peter assumed was the surface. Azure led the way, his blue fur almost glowing in the dimness. After what seemed like hours of walking, they saw light ahead, not the artificial luminescence of the hidden city, but natural daylight, albeit strangely diffused and tinted with colors Peter had never seen in sunlight before. They emerged onto a landscape so alien that for a moment they could only stand and stare in wonder. The sky above was not the blue they had known all their lives, but a shifting tapestry of colors, purples, greens, and hues for which Peter had no names. The land stretched before them, rolling. Hills covered in vegetation that seemed to pulse with inner light. In the distance, what appeared to be trees reached toward the strange sky, their branches moving in patterns too regular to be caused by wind. The quiet lands, breathed his voice hushed with awe. It's real. They took their first tentative steps into this new world, half expecting some barrier to repel them. But the ground felt solid beneath their feet, the air breathable if oddly sweet. Mila moved ahead of them, her steps becoming lighter, almost dancing as she reached out to touch the luminescent plants that lined their path. They responded to her touch, bending toward her as if in greeting. It knows me, she said, turning back to them with a smile that illuminated her face. This place, it recognizes what I am. For the first time since they had found her, Mila looked truly at peace. The constant fear that had shadowed her eyes was gone, replaced by a sense of belonging that was almost palpable. They walked further into this strange new land, alert for any danger, but encountering none. The silence was profound but not oppressive, less an absence of sound than a presence of quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. As they crested a hill, they saw buildings in the valley below, structures that blended so perfectly with the landscape that they might have grown rather than been built. And there were people or beings that appeared human at first glance, moving among the structures with the same fluid grace as the entities in the hidden city. Others like us, Sarah wondered. Travelers who found this place. Let's find out, Peter suggested, leading them down toward the settlement. They were spotted long before they reached the outskirts of the community. A welcoming party of sorts met them halfway. 3 individuals who, upon closer inspection, proved to be human in appearance, if not entirely in bearing. There was a stillness to them, a centered calm that reminded Peter of the beings in the hidden city, though these individuals were clearly physical rather than energy-based. Welcome, travelers, the foremost of them greeted, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that reflected the shifting colors of the sky. We have been expecting you. Expecting us, Peter echoed, immediately wary. How? The woman smiled, the expression gentle and genuine. This land speaks to those who can listen. It told us of your coming, of your journey, of the child you protect. She turned her gaze to Mila, her smile deepening. Especially you, little one. You are of the between, as are many of us. You have found your way home. Mila stepped forward, studying the woman with solemn eyes. Home, she repeated, testing the word. My father said we were looking for home when we came to this world, and now you have found it, the woman confirmed, though by a more circuitous route than he might have planned. She turned her attention back to Peter, Sarah, and Duel. And you 3, humans who chose to protect rather than exploit. Rare indeed, you have earned a place here if you wish to stay. What is here exactly? Sarah asked, still cautious despite the warm welcome. What is this place? A sanctuary, the woman replied, a pocket of reality where those who exist between worlds can live in peace. Some call it the quiet lands, others the fold. We simply call it haven. And the hunters, Peter pressed, unwilling to lower his guard completely. The ones who pursued us, can they find this place? The woman shook her head. They cannot even perceive its entrance without one of the between to guide them, and none here would do so. You are safe, truly. Safe for the first time since you began your journey. The promise of safety after so long. Running and fighting was almost too much to comprehend. Peter exchanged glances with Sarah and Duel, seeing his own cautious hope reflected in their eyes. Come, the woman invited, gesturing toward the settlement. Rest, eat meat. Others who have found their way here. Then decide if this is where your journey ends or merely where a new one begins. They followed their guides into the heart of Haven, greeted with curiosity and warmth by its inhabitants. As promised, there were others like Mila, blue-skinned with those distinctive violet eyes, though many were older. Adults who had perhaps lived here for years or even generations. They were given a dwelling, a living structure that seemed to have been grown rather than built, its walls translucent and faintly pulsing like the vegetation outside. Food was provided, strange but delicious. Fruits and vegetables unlike anything they had encountered before. As night fell, or what passed for night in this realm, a dimming of the sky to deep indigo rather than true darkness. They sat together on a terrace, overlooking the settlement, processing all they had seen and learned. So Peter said, finally breaking the comfortable silence, "What do we think?" "It seems too good to be true," Sarah admitted, her natural skepticism still not entirely overcome. "A perfect sanctuary appearing just when we needed it most." "Not appearing," Duel corrected her. "It was always here. We just couldn't find it without Mila." They looked to the child who sat cross-legged on the floor, communing silently with Azure. The wolf had been accepted without question by the inhabitants of Haven, treated as an equal rather than a pet or wild beast. "What about you, Mila?" Peter asked gently. "What do you want to do?" She looked up, her violet eyes reflecting the strange stars that had begun to appear in the indigo sky. "I want to stay," she said simply. "I feel right here, like I've been looking for this place without knowing it." Peter nodded, having expected as much. The child had found her people, a place where she wasn't hunted or feared, but celebrated for what she was. How could they deny her that? "And you?" he asked, turning to Sarah and Duel. "This isn't your world, not mine either, for that matter." Duel shrugged his massive shoulders. "What waits for me out there? More fighting, more surviving day to day. Here there could be peace." "Peace sounds good," Sarah agreed softly. "I've almost forgotten what that feels like." Peter leaned back, considering they had all been wanderers before finding Mila, outcasts in their own way, moving from place to place, never truly belonging anywhere. Perhaps that was why they had been able to perceive the entrance to the quiet lands. Perhaps they too existed partly between, without even knowing it. "Then we stay," he decided, "at least for now. See if this place is truly what it appears to be." Mila's face lit up with joy, and even Azure seemed to approve, his tail thumping against the floor in a rare display of canine behavior. The days that followed were a period of adjustment and discovery. They learned more about Haven and its inhabitants, a diverse community of beings from various realities who had found their way to this sanctuary over countless generations. Some were like Mila, blue-skinned and violet-eyed. Others appeared human but possessed abilities that set them apart. Still others were more alien in appearance, their form strange and wonderful to behold. What united them all was a sense of belonging, of having found their place in a multiverse that had often rejected or exploited them for their differences. In Haven, those differences were celebrated, even revered. Mila flourished in this environment. She began training with others of her kind, learning to control and expand the telepathic abilities that had allowed her to communicate with Azure. The wolf remained her constant companion, but she formed new friendships as well, particularly with a group of children who taught her the strange games they played in the luminescent fields surrounding the settlement. Sarah found her calling in the healing arts, studying with Haven's skilled practitioners who combined physical medicine with energetic techniques that bordered on what the outside world might call magic. Her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies was valued and expanded upon, giving her a sense of purpose she had long lacked. Dual, somewhat to everyone's surprise, discovered a talent for teaching. His experience as a warrior made him an ideal instructor for Haven's defenders, those tasked with maintaining the subtle energetic boundaries that kept the sanctuary hidden from hostile forces. He found satisfaction in passing on his hard-won knowledge, in preparing others to protect what they had all come to value. And Peter, he watched his makeshift family find their places, content for a time, simply to rest, to recover from the wounds, both physical and spiritual, that their journey had inflicted. But as weeks turned to months, he found himself growing restless. The peace of Haven was real, the sanctuary genuine, but something called to him from beyond its boundaries. He finally confessed his feelings to the others one evening as they gathered in their shared dwelling, now personalized with items they had created or been given by their new neighbors. "I need to go back," he said simply. "Not permanently. But there are others out there like Mila, being hunted, exploited. They deserve a chance to find this place too." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "You want to be a guide," she said, "to bring others to Haven?" Peter nodded. "Something like that. Now that I know the way, I can't just stay here in safety while others suffer." Duel grunted his understanding. "A warrior's heart never truly rests," he observed, "even in paradise." Mila's reaction concerned Peter the most. Would she see his desire to leave as abandonment? But the child surprised him, as she so often did. "You should go," she said with the simple directness that was her hallmark. "Find others like me, bring them home." Her use of the word home to describe Haven cemented Peter's decision. This was her home now, truly and completely. His role in her journey was complete. But perhaps his own journey was just beginning. The leaders of Haven understood his decision and supported it. They provided him with knowledge and tools that would help him identify others of the between and guide them safely to sanctuary. They also gave him a token, a small crystal that would allow him to perceive the entrance to the quiet lands without needing one of the between as a guide. On the day of his departure, his small family gathered at the boundary of Haven to say their goodbyes. Sarah embraced him tightly, whispering, "Don't be gone too long. This is your home too, whether you realize it or not." Duel clasped his forearm in the warrior's grip they had shared since their earliest days together. Fight well, he said simply, and return when you can. Mila was the last to approach. She had grown in the months they had spent in Haven, not just physically, but in confidence and presence. She held out. Small object, a pendant made of the same luminescent material as many of the structures in Haven, so you can always find your way back to us, she explained as she placed it around his neck. Peter knelt to embrace her, this child, who had changed the course of his life so profoundly. I will always come back, he promised. You are my family, all of you. With a final wave, he turned and stepped through the boundary of Haven, back into the world they had left behind. The landscape shifted around him. Vibrant colors and living light of the quiet lands fading into the more familiar, if harsher, reality he had known before. But he carried Haven with him, in his memories, in the crystal and pendant he wore, and in the knowledge that somewhere beyond the veil of ordinary perception, a true sanctuary existed. Place where those who existed between could find peace, acceptance, and community, and he would find others who needed that sanctuary, guide them as he had been guided, until all who deserved a home could find one. Behind him, though he could no longer see it, Haven continued to thrive. Sarah healed the sick and wounded, Dole trained new defenders, Azure watched over the settlement from the hills above, and Mila, the child whose whispered plea had started it all, grew in wisdom and power, preparing for the day when she too might venture out to guide others home. For in the end, that was the greatest gift they had discovered in their journey. Not just a place of safety, but a purpose, a way to transform their own suffering into salvation for others, a chance to make meaning from the chaos of existence. And in a universe of infinite possibilities, there was no greater treasure than that.